We're good to go, sir.
Very good. Good afternoon or evening. We're right in that transition time. Welcome to the October 14 Utility Board special meeting. I'm Chair Tim O'Connell. In accordance with the Governor's Proclamation 2028.11 and the Safe Start Order, the Utility Board meeting tonight is being conducted by video conferencing technology provided by Zoom. The Zoom video is being broadcast live via Zoom and will be uploaded to the city's YouTube channel later this evening. With us today are Public Works Director Jason Kittner, Council Member Lisa Andrel, our liaison, and several other staff members from the Public Works Department and other departments of the city. Welcome, and we look forward to your participation this evening. Other public audience members are listening in through the telephone or via the net. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining us this afternoon or evening. We should have a fairly full and interesting agenda today. Members of the board, could you please ensure your microphones are on, because I'll ask Madam City Clerk to please call roll.
Okay, Chair O'Connell.
I'm here.
Vice Chair DeBoyer.
Present.
Board Member Majewski.
Present.
Board Member Marshall.
Present.
Board Member Milton.
Present.
Board Member Picorni.
Present.
Board Member Thomas.
I can see that Brian is muted, but we can also tell that he is driving currently.
And he just waved.
I just saw him wave at us. I would take that as acknowledgement that he has appeared.
All right, thank you very much, sir.
First off, I was freezing. Can everybody hear me there?
Mm-hmm.
Just wave if you can hear me. Yes? Yes, all right. We do anticipate having a full agenda this evening, including what has typically been for us a vigorous discussion about rate recommendations. So I would like to make a suggestion that, if at all possible, please use the raise your hand feature if you click on the participants, the box appears on the right of the screen. I will do my best to make sure that everyone is recognized in the order that, at least it appears to me, that people have chimed in. So do please use the raise the hand feature. Again, on the participants box at the bottom of the Zoom screen, a legend will appear on the right identifying everybody who's participating. And if you look down at the bottom, again on the right, there's a thing that says raise hand. So please use that to make sure that we can get everybody recognized in an orderly fashion. I know it's tempting, particularly because we have such a collegial interaction when we're meeting in person. I know it's tempting to just launch in, but then sometimes we have people talking over one another. And I really will do my best to make sure everybody gets recognized. If you do use the raise hand feature and I do recognize you, I'd ask you to, it's kind of a toggle, you got to toggle it off so that I don't think you still have your hand raised. I will try to have everyone get a fair shot and get your turn in. We'll typically go by a question and then a clarification before we allow others to speak. With those kinds of housekeeping matters, I'd like to turn to the first item of the agenda, which is to approve the minutes of our September 23 meeting. I may have a comment on that, but I think first I need a motion to approve the minutes. And whoever might make the motion, remember you have to unmute yourself.
So moved.
Is there a second? Thank you, Vice Chair Bohr.
Second.
Thanks. Appreciate that, Will. Thank you. It's been moved and seconded for the to approve the minutes. No one else has a comment. I do. So I'd open it up if anyone else has a comment as to the minutes. I particularly because in the last meeting, we made a point of clarifying the previous meeting's minutes to reflect that we had taken a motion reflecting our concern with the King County Interceptor project. I think it might be appropriate that the minutes be amended to reflect the fact that there was a consensus of the board expressing appreciation to King County for the recognition they had made of that and the modifications they had made to their proposal that were responsive to some of the concerns this board had raised. If anyone else shares that observation, I would suggest someone should make a motion to that effect. Anybody?
I'll move.
I'll second.
I heard Tom move and Brian second. Any further discussion?
That was actually George Marshall who made the motion.
Oh, thank you, Tom. It was Member Marshall who made the motion. I'm pretty sure it was Brian who seconded. Any further discussion? If not, I'll call for the question, and do remember you have to unmute. If you're in favor, please say aye.
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 Any opposed? Any opposed, please say nay. I hear no opposition. I think that passed by acclamation. With that modification, any further discussion of the minutes? If not, Madam Clerk, could you please call the roll on that?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Chair O'Connell,
Aye.
Vice Chair DeVoyer,
Aye.
Board Member Majewski,
Aye.
Board Member Marshall,
Aye.
Board Member Milton,
Aye.
Board Member McCorney. Is that an aye?
Aye, yeah.
Thank you. And Board Member Thomas.
Aye.
Thank you, sir.
Very good. Thank you. Next item of business is our discussion reviewing we're going to have a discussion and a presentation about the water and sewer rates, and then we will have a discussion and ultimately make recommendations as to the stormwater, water and sewer rates for next year. You will recall that our last session, we already took action and formally made a recommendation regarding the rates for the EMS portion of our charge. With that, I think I'll turn it over to Jason to kind of lead us into the discussion about the water rates and sewer rates. I know we're having a presentation from our outside consultants, so Director Kittner, if you'd like to take the lead on that, I would welcome you to do so.
Sure. Good evening, members of the board. Jason Kittner, Public Works Director. So as you saw in the packet, we provided some background information on the water, the sewer, and the stormwater rates for discussion tonight. I believe the FCS team is here to make the presentation. I see them on the screen. There's Angie popping up. And we have members from our finance team as well as myself and other members from the Public Works team here to help answer questions. Recall, we are looking for a rate recommendation from the utility board tonight that will go in front of the council for adoption on November 17th, 2020. And as is customary, the utility board chair or vice chair, whoever's available that evening, will report back to the council based off of our conversation and discussion this evening. Matt or Lawan, do you have anything else to add before we pass it over to Angie and the FCS group?
Thank you, Jason. Let's just get going.
All right, wonderful. I will share my screen now and we will get that presentation started. Perfect. How is that? Can everybody see my screen?
No, I can't.
Not yet, Angie.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, nothing's popping up.
All righty, let me check that again here. All right, let's see, share. Perfect. How about that?
There we go. Now you got us.
Perfect. Wonderful. Well, good evening. I have, my name's Angie Sanchez, and I have Chase Bazette here with me, who helped put the utility rates together. And so essentially what we wanted to do this evening is, we were before you on September 23rd talking a bit about the stormwater preliminary findings and discussing some of the key assumptions and various different areas and assumptions and factors that went into updating that rate update. Tonight, we'd like to focus on the water and sewer utilities. And again, very similarly, we will use that similar format that we had to talk a little bit about, what those particular assumptions, data inputs were, and finally the preliminary water and sewer findings for that rate study update. We'll then bring back a couple of the stormwater slides just as a refresher, so that we have a complete picture of the discussion that will take place at the end of the presentation as well. And so we'll bring back those stormwater findings as well. And then we'll talk a little bit about next steps, but for sure want to allow sufficient time for questions and answers. So just to quickly orient ourselves to this particular graphic again, essentially what we're looking at is when we're evaluating each utility, we are looking at that utility financial obligations on a standalone basis. So we want the fees charged for those various different services to be able to support the particular costs associated with providing that service. And so we look at direct and indirect costs. If you recall, we are looking at fiscal policies, as well as the operating budget, capital improvement needs, as well as any debt service obligations that we may have to identify what the overall revenue requirement will be. We do take an extended look, so we have that out through 2026, but the focus will be on the 2021 through 2022 biennial period. So jumping right into more specifically on the water and sewer. So the first item that we talked about is the financial policies. So essentially that sets the foundation for management of the utilities. And we really like to make sure that when we're mindful of those particular policies, as well as in compliance with those particular policies. And so similar to the stormwater utility, what we see here is we have the operating reserve, and that is essentially there to meet daily cash flow operations. For the water utility, we have set that at 90 days of operating and maintenance expenses, and sewer 30 days of operating and maintenance expenses. Many times you will see the difference there in terms of that target revenue level or minimum fund balance level, simply because the water has a bit more volatility to their rates because of the user fees or the volume charge. And so many times, we will hold a little bit more in reserve in order to make sure that we have sufficient funding available. The capital reserve, again, there is more to provide a source of funding for emergency repairs or unanticipated cost overruns. The water and sewer utility have been set at a certain percentage of your capital assets. And again, for the sewer utility, is slightly higher than the water, is that the sewer system facilities are generally a bit more higher in value in terms of the original cost. And so having that set at a bit higher than the water utility is also somewhat common and is consistent with historical practice of the city. The third one there, system reinvestment funding. And again, there we're trying to keep a critical infrastructure in good repair. You do have a very good policy target for each of your utilities. In this particular case, that target is for the water to hold $3.9 million in annual system reinvestment funding. That is not currently being met today, but we are looking at phasing it in over time so that we hit that target in 2026. But again, the policy target is trying to hit that $3.9 million level. The sewer utility is phased into $2 million level. And again, that was based and in compliance with the fiscal policy targets for that utility. A couple more financial policies, and the first one here didn't come into play simply because the stormwater utility didn't have any debt funding, but you do have a capital funding scenario or excuse me, policy that helps determine the basis for what projects should be cash funded and what projects should be debt funded. And so as you can see there on the very top line under the target, it says the city will make a good attempt to cash fund projects under $2 million and seek potential alternative funding methods for projects over $2 million to mitigate rate impacts. And so that also has been used in terms of when we looked at the capital funding program to potentially isolate and target various different capital projects that may be up for debt financing. Debt service coverage, again, the financial measurement of your ability to repay debt. There, due to bond covenants, the minimum requirement is 1.25. If we are to go out to the bond market, we generally like to see something higher than the minimum, which you all are generally at. But again, the minimum requirement for that policy is 1.25. And then the one that's close and near and dear to my heart that you all have, which I'm happy to see, is you actually have a rate equity policy. And that is to establish rates and charges equitably and to equitably cover the cost of the services from each of the utilities customers. And essentially what that's trying to target is that each utility meets all utility financial obligations on a standalone basis. And again, that is the approach that we are using here. So in compliance.
Ms. Sanchez, can you take a question?
Yes.
When you say a minimum bond covenant requirement 1.25, what do you mean by that? 1.25 of what?
Right, so we look at your total revenue of the system minus just your operating costs. And then with the remaining that's left over is divided by your revenue bond obligation. And so it's really the, what's left over. So you have to have enough sufficient to cover 1.25 times that particular expense.
Got it. Thank you.
So moving into more of the specific data inputs and assumptions for the water and sewer utility, what we see, again, similarly for the stormwater, is we're looking at the study period of 2021 through 2026, with, again, the focus really being on the next biennial period of 21 through 22. The water revenue, or excuse me, rate revenue in general, we had quite a bit of discussion in terms of the water revenue and what level to essentially set that. Do we use the 2020 budget? How are we faring due to COVID? Again, because that rate structure does have various different, more volatility than your sewer rates, for instance, simply because sewer is, the majority of our sewer utility revenue is that from that fixed charge. And so the discussion that we had essentially is we looked at the 2019 actual levels, we looked at the year-to-date 2019, kind of where we were as of September to see kind of how we were tracking. Now there was a rate adjustment in 2020, but based on how we were tracking close to 2019 levels, and we do believe that's likely due to COVID impacts, and that we're not realizing as much of the additional revenue from that rate impact that we had originally hoped. And so we had maintained the water revenue at 2019 levels. And so that is kind of the discussion that took place, and that is what is being used rather than the initial 2020 budget numbers that we were looking at. Sewer, again, there is looking at the 2020 budget levels being maintained. Again, we are including 0% growth here. And so we are including that budget level estimate for revenues, but water was a little bit more intense of a discussion just to ensure that we're feeling comfortable with that. In terms of the expenses, we are looking at the 21-22 biennial budget as a baseline for those expenses for those initial 2-year time period. Now there was a discussion about that city tax increasing to 8% in 2021 and 22, and then decreasing back to 5.3% in 2023. We do want to provide one clarification to that. When we were discussing that question, I think we had mentioned that it might have been embedded in the bill. We had an opportunity to go back and look at that, and that is actually on top of the bill. And so the rates that you see here do not include that, and it's actually in addition to that bill is the city tax. In terms of, again, the capital improvement program, the city did provide that particular capital improvement program and has been looking at that quite extensively, with the focus really on prioritizing critical infrastructure maintenance is the goal there. So now we're going to start moving into each of the specific utilities independently. And so we'll start with the water utility first. And so in terms of the water utility, what we wanted to show here is operating costs only. So from the information that was provided in terms of the budget and how those particular costs break out on an annual basis, we have the graph here that shows 2021 through 2026. And so working from the bottom up, we have the operating and maintenance costs that are in total $5.5 to $6.6 million, but your O&M costs range about 3.1 to 3.6 over that time period. You'll note that the Seattle Public Utility water purchases, SPU water purchases, it ranged from $2.3 million increasing to about $2.9 million over that particular time period. And then the very small sliver that you see at the very top is your existing debt service, and that is about $110,000 per year on existing debt. And so you can see we're slightly increasing, in terms of inflationary increases with SPU, kind of taking a bit of more of that overall increase as you move out over time. Oops, excuse me. Going backwards here. When we go to the capital plan, so we looked at the operating, now we're looking at the capital improvement program. Over the time period, again, that 21 through 26, you'll see that the bars represent the overall capital spend that is anticipated in any of those given years. And so you can see 2021 is a little bit lower, followed by a peak in 2022, and then it slightly declines over time for the rest of the time period. In total, we're looking at about 33.1 million in costs from 2021 through 26, with, again, those 4 bullets there listing some of the major capital projects that are actually being shown in those particular years. You can see the peak there being in the 2022 time period. And again, some of those larger capital projects are various water system improvements, beginning of the meter replacement program, some booster chlorination type of projects, and SCADA projects, as well as some reservoir improvements. And so when we look at that capital program, essentially, again, what we're looking at is what are the available resources that we have from rate funded capital, as well as our beginning fund balances that we could put towards meeting the overall capital requirements in any given year. And only after that point would we then look at, in order to complete the capital plan, would we have to go out for debt financing. In this particular case, we do show that in 2022, it does appear that about 3.5 million in debt proceeds would be required in order, again, to meet the capital program timing as we have displayed here in this particular slide. Now, the dotted lines that you see there is to show you the system reinvestment funding that you all are kind of starting to begin to formalize and make sure that we are meeting that fiscal policy target of about the $3.9 million over time by the time we reach 2026. And so we are starting at about $2.7 million and then increasing that over time to $3.9 million. So at the beginning of the time period when we need it, we can't quite support our overall needs with that level of funding. So we do have to deplete reserves and use potentially some debt service funding in order to accomplish the capital program. When we bring the operating and capital requirements together, and so again, the operating table that we saw on the previous slide, we have operating and maintenance expenses at the bottom. We have our Seattle public utility purchases in the second to the bottom. We then have our sliver of existing debt service. Because of the addition of the potentially new $3.5 million of new debt service, you can see in 2022, that new debt service comes online in order to support that particular debt obligation. And then the bigger area, kind of the last area here, is system reinvestment funding. That is that policy target that we're talking about, again, increasing over time to that $3.9 million level. When we look at this particular chart, again, we're looking at our annual obligations on an annual basis. We're comparing that to the existing revenue levels at existing rates. And so assuming no additional rate adjustment from your current levels, how much can we support and for how long? And so as you can see, we go out over time, we're kind of hitting fairly closely in 2021, but by the time we get to 2022, we are now starting to infringe on our capital funding that is being required, as well as meeting that policy objective of system reinvestment to try to get us to that 3.9. And that deficiency, that gap, is increasing over time should we not do any type of rate action in terms of the future, which also does mean that we are not generating sufficient funding to meet the capital program as outlined. And so again, the overall goal is, okay, if we needed to fund all of our obligations, we do need to identify how do we get to this dashed line up above. And so what that means for the water utility in terms of a sample single family bill, we have the bi-monthly increase at the top and the monthly increase at the bottom. So for a 3/4 inch meter using 1,400 cubic feet of water usage for the bi-monthly period, your existing bill would be $110.29 today. That would increase to about $116.08 and then $122.17 over that biennial period. So a bi-monthly increase of $579 to $609, translated to about 5.25% increase. And again, if you're kind of like myself and think of things more on the monthly basis, that would be about $2.89 to about $3.05 for those particular time periods. And that's a monthly increase for each of those years. So I can pause there if you'd like, or I can continue on in the sewer revenue requirements. Anybody have any questions on the water before we move on? And again, we'll open it up again towards the end should you have any additional questions we can go back to. Okay. So when we look at sewer, again, very similar format to water. We are looking at 2021 through 2026, and again, looking at our operational costs only at this particular time. So we have our O&M costs at the bottom. We can then see our King County treatment costs, which are fairly significant and ranging about 60 to 63% of our total operating costs on the system, which is very significant. And although it is a pass-through revenue, it does have an impact in terms of the overall customer bill that they will ultimately see. But we did want to show that what kind of proportional level of costs we have strictly from the King County treatment costs, and that's ranges about 5.1 to about $6.5 million per year. The orange, again, similarly, is the existing debt service that you currently have on the system, and that runs about $1 million per year. And that is consistent throughout this time period. And so total operating costs for sewer utility are $8.5 to $10.3 million. And again, the time period that we're looking at. When we look at the capital plan for this particular utility, it actually is slightly lower in terms of the 21-22, and then kind of has various different, peaks as we go out over time. And so over time through the 2026 time period, we have about 20.6 million in capital spending. Again, you can see here, SCADA system, lake line locating and marketing, and lake line condition assessment, which actually kind of start showing you kind of where these peaks are happening is when some of those larger projects are actually compounding on not only the additional annual repair and replacement that we're trying to do, but some of these bigger projects are kind of stacking on top of that. And so you can see some of these peaks happening. And so, again, using the same approach, looking at existing revenue resources that we have available to us, rate revenue, fees, as well as reserve balances, how can we fare in terms of funding our capital needs? And so as we look out over time and through the particular time period, it does look like we would be in need of potentially a $2.5 million debt proceed in 2022, and possibly another $3 million in 2025. Again, that remains to be seen, depending on what we look like as we get out into the future. So when we again look at that particular funding, we're looking at about $220,000 in annual debt service for that first particular issue. And again, we'll see that as we come in once we bring the operating and capital needs together. Similarly, with this dashed line is just kind of showing you what our funding level is for system reinvestment through rates. And again, in this particular case, we are trying to target $2 million. And so we do begin at about 1.5 in 2021 and get to that $2 million mark by the end of the time period.
Angie, before you go on, let me just just one quick second, since we do have a couple new board members. Just the lake line, the sewer lake line, is a famous sewer lake line to Mercer O&M staff. Our sewage conveys, basically it's a gravity fed system from basically the spot of the island towards the lakefront, and then we have a sewer pipe in Lake Washington that conveys it around the perimeter of the island off to the treatment facility in the King County system. We have replaced a portion of this lake line back in circa 2010 timeframe, but there is a large section of a 13-mile pipe that we don't know where it's actually located in Lake Washington. We don't know the current condition of that lake line, that sewer pipe. And we don't know the expected useful life of that pipe. It's just sort of, it's an educated guess based off of some experts that have evaluated sort of other lake lines around the region. So these projects you see listed here are a direct result of our general sewer plan that was adopted last year. And this was a key recommendation that came out of it, was to find that lake line and then figure out how to get into it to understand the remaining useful life of it, and what potential opportunities to maintain it moving forward are. So I just wanted to pause. We have a couple new board members. Just want to give you a quick update on what the lake line is. Thank you for letting me interrupt.
Thank you. And so we're going to have a series of summary charts, a couple summary charts, show you some different approaches that we have here. The first one being just in total, including King County treatment costs. And so again, we have our operating costs at the bottom. We have our King County costs, and as you can see here, these are the costs that are actually increasing, fairly significantly compared to the other costs, because there are some forecasted increases that King County has alerted us to. And so again, that remains to see as they actually go out over time if those are actually implemented, but we have incorporated that forecast in here. And so there's fairly significant in terms of, some fairly consistent increases over time with some various different jumps in 2023 and 2025, which is more historical practice than annual increases for them. They kind of do every 2-year increases historically, except for 21 and 22. We then have our existing debt service in the orange, as you can see there. And then starting in 2022, we have our new debt service for that initial project increases in 2025 should you need that additional debt issue to complete those various different projects. And as you can see, that kind of gets a little bit bigger there. And then finally, towards the end, we have our system reinvestment funding, which is that various different target, which we're trying to get to about $2 million in terms of being able to support that level of funding for our capital projects. When we look at, again, that solid line, which is, here's our existing rate revenue that we have available to us. We are doing, okay in 2021, beginning in 2022, we are starting to erode and get into that, capital funding. We are meeting our operating costs, however, but again, as you go out over time, that gap starts, again, infringing on the availability of capital funding that is needed in order to fund our capital program, as well as meet that various different fiscal policy that we have outlined in our policies. I'm going to show you a different view, the local portion. So this particular view has King County in here. When we hit this slide 16, we remove King County and strictly are looking at our local portion. And so again, here it puts a little bit more perspective and kind of gives you a little bit more granular view of how this is actually showing in terms of our system reinvestment. So again, similar approach, O&M, existing debt, new debt, and system reinvestment funding. So again, we're starting to go deficient in terms of our ability to meet our overall obligations, operating and capital. And then as you go out over time, we're starting to, again, to be able to support less capacity in terms of capital funding if we did not do any type of rate action with our rates over time. And so again, we're meeting our operating costs, but really our focus and the driver of these various different local rate increases are that target system reinvestment funding policy and our capital needs. So we have 2 slides here. The first slide is going to be that bi-monthly bill. And here it gets a little complicated simply because of the King County portion here as well. But we have, how this is broken out is we have at the very left-hand side, we have our local bill, we have the King County bill, and then the total bill. And then we kind of call out what that local increase is, because that's really what we have the control over here. And so our existing current rate on the local side is 90.26, excuse me. King County Metro bi-monthly bill is 90.66 for a total bill of 180.92. That would increase to 93.87, or about an increase of $3.61 on the local level for that particular year. And again, this is bi-monthly, and $3.76 increase in 2022, again, followed by various different projections that would be updated over time. Added to that, however, is the King County increase, which again was what the customer is going to essentially see on their bill, but which is essentially just a pass through. And as you can see kind of here on the second to the bottom line, that's King County % increase. So they are anticipating, 4.5% increases in 2021 and 22. And then it jumps up to their typical historical 2-year rate adjustments at 10.25, excuse me, in 2023, and another 10.24 in 2025. And so when we saw that graphic, you can kind of see how those costs were increasing over time and where they were kind of jumping. That was due to those various larger increases that we see in terms of the forecast they provided. But on more of the local level, again, what we can kind of have control over here, we're looking at $3.61 to $3.76 on a bi-monthly bill in terms of a single family bill. And then if you look more towards the monthly bill, it's about $1.81 to $1.88 in terms of that impact. So that was the new information that we had for you. Just quickly doing a quick brief recap of the stormwater. So what we have in terms of the stormwater utility, again, these similar operating reserves, we do have a 30-day O&M target for stormwater. We have a 2% of our capital assets. Now we are phasing in something different on the stormwater because each of the utilities has a various different targeted system reinvestment funding. And then for this particular utility, it's $1.2 million by the year 2026. Stormwater is not anticipating any debt service coverage, but we still look at that debt service coverage requirement of 1.25. Again, when we're looking at the stormwater utility, it was about $8.5 million through the 2026 time period. with a number of different water course stabilization projects, culvert replacements, and system assessment and improvements taking up the majority of the capital costs. It does, kind of ebb and flow over the annual basis, but somewhat consistent in terms of some of the overall annual costs that we see there. Again, no anticipated new debt service for the stormwater utility, that we would be funding what is needed from available revenue funds and also fund balances. And you can see here kind of working to that policy to eventually get us to that $1.2 million annual funding that we can support from rates. And then in terms of the operating and the capital needs, which the capital needs represented here by that system reinvestment funding. And so we see here that together for the annual basis is that, over time, again, 2021, we're cutting it close. But again, as we get into 2022 and beyond, our existing rate revenue levels are not quite sufficient to support our capital needs. And so we're beginning to get and erode down our capital capacity funding at existing rates, and the gap kind of widens as we go out over time. That is represented by a bi-monthly increase of about $1.97 to $2.07, and so that averages on a monthly basis probably about slightly over $1 or near $1 monthly impact for the stormwater utility for those years. So with that, I'm going to pause and open it up to questions, because really what we wanted to do here is basically want to answer any type of questions, bring you some type of clarification for not only the presentation, but also, the materials that you were provided beforehand in terms of the memo and anything that was included there as well.
Very good. Thank you, Ms. Valdez. Steve Milton, you had a question?
Yeah, I had a few, just kind of wrote them down as I went.
One at a time, Steve, one at a time.
Fair enough. So I'll start with the bigger one then. So in the PDFs that were sent along in the email along with the agenda that had the kind of more detailed description of the individual changes to each department's budget there. There were our kind of prior recommended 5-year rate changes that we had kind of looked at in the past and proposed, and it looked like on both on the stormwater, for instance, our kind of prior vision of updates was around a 3.2% update over time, and then the new one here is showing it 5.5%. On the water utility rate, the prior kind of estimated rate updates was going to be 6.5%, and then on your new proposals down to 5.25%. And then the third one was on the sewer utility. Again, our previous understanding of how much it was going to take to keep up with all the capital expenditures was 7.7% increases, and under your new study, it's showing a 4% increase over time. So just all those ended up being fairly far apart, and the two bigger departments being reductions in the actual kind of expected amount of rate increase. I'm curious, I guess, of kind of what the big difference is in the kind of the assumptions that were made in those previous updates, and is this related to kind of some of the larger 2020 reorgs within the city and departmental reorgs and staffing reductions and or the reallocation of different employees within the city? So I understand that's a big, that's not one question in that, but that was it seems like a pretty big divergence between our previous kind of understanding of the future of the departmental budgets and what we're looking at now. I'm just curious what that difference is relating to.
Angie, this is Deb. I'm going to interrupt you for just a moment. Could I get you to stop sharing your screen while we're answering questions?
Sure. Let me find my little stop share again here. Perfect.
Thank you.
I'll take the first crack at this, and then Luana and Matt, feel free to add to it. So I think one of the big drivers is, and Steve, you hit on a couple things, is we do have a new organizational structure. We have a lot of new staff members in different roles. As you'll recall, every 2 years when we update the budget process, we go through the capital program and we really try and refine numbers, fine tune projects, and, you know, put pencil to paper and really put together a capital program that is worthy and possible in the next 2 years. I always say in this particular budget development year, more than any other that I've been part of, we really try to limit what can actually get done. And so what you see in the capital program is actually less total number of projects. And again, there's a lot of projects out years that still have a need, but we can't get them done in a 2-year time period. But what you do see is that these projects, and some of them you've seen for a couple of years now, do have a larger dollar amount to them, right? It's more expensive to do work now. And so there's a little bit of balancing there, but I would say there's less projects in the capital program, especially within the first 2 years. But it's really reflective of the work that needs to get done within the utilities. I will say water comes to mind, where I think our water capital program is more diversified than it has been in the past, right? You're seeing the reservoir improvements, which we talked about 2 years ago. This is a relining of our reservoirs and some other things that came out of a Department of Health sanitary survey requirement, some other modifications like that. It's no longer just pipe replacement projects. And that's not to say we didn't have other things in our capital program before. But I think in my time as Public Works Director in the last 5 years, this is probably the most diversified set of projects we have. It's probably the smallest number of capital projects within a 2-year time period. And that's really reflective of the people to actually get the work done. So we really focused on that effort this capital program cycle.
Okay, and so since you're focusing in on the 2-year window for those projects, are those other projects that are in those out years in the kind of the 5-year plan, so those are still basically budgeted as a part of this approximated longer, 5-year smoothed, rate increase, right? So those are, it's not that they were removed from the budget, but that they were pushed further out. So they were there before. So that doesn't necessarily or I don't really understand then how it reduces the overall spend over that 5-year period.
Because there's other projects that happen in that 6-year time period that are now off the 6-year horizon.
Okay.
7,
Okay.
8, or 9. So
some pushed off the end entirely. Okay.
Really did try and focus on what's available in the next 2 and 6 years.
Okay. That makes more sense.
Thank you, Steve. Tom, you had a question? And you are muted right now. There you go.
I'm curious about the system reinvestment funds, and I can't remember, have those been in place for a while in each of those utilities, and why haven't they been fully funded before now? And why do we expect them to be fully funded over the next 5 years?
So maybe I'll take that potentially, and the city can chime in. It has been a policy, it was my understanding, for quite some time. A lot of times those particular policies are not fully funded simply because of the rate impact that it has on actually achieving those particular policy objectives. And so again, when we first started the rate study update, essentially what we wanted to do is say, well, what policies do we have out there and what are the various different obligations? And if we were intended to essentially fund these particular policies, how can we get that accomplished within the time frame that we looked at? So we didn't want to do it day one, because that would have had a very large rate impact immediately if we were trying to fund those various targets, within this next year. And so we looked at trying to get to those policy targets over time. Now, key to that system reinvestment funding is that is how the city has been able to fund a lot of their capital programs without using debt. And so it's a great policy to have. It does put a lot of rate pressure because you're no longer necessarily spreading it out with debt service. You're really cash financing on an ongoing basis those overall revenue and those overall capital needs that you have. Good policy, but again, sometimes it gets pushed aside or gets delayed simply because of the overall rate impact that it'll have on your customers.
And maybe just a follow-up, if they were fully funded, the policy of debt versus rate funded projects, would you use the money in the system reinvestment to to essentially rate fund a capital project that you would, if it was a standalone, would be over the threshold that you would normally debt fund?
I think, that is something actually that we even discussed this particular time period is, do we use cash or do we, use some of those various different capital projects for debt funding? Is it a good, really, is it a good particular project to be able to debt finance? And so I think that is an ongoing conversation that, you do have on an annual basis or whenever that, various different project needs to be funded is, is this a good particular project that would, that we should be using debt service for or not? Many times what you'll say is if it's a project that is going to be long life, and so future customers may be able to benefit from that, then you would likely debt finance that because it's called, we always refer to it as intergenerational equity, is those who are going to use the asset are actually going to be paying for it, not only just the ratepayers today paying for something that future ratepayers will use. And so there are various different projects that make sense a lot of times to debt finance because again, they're that long life asset. You can kind of match the life of, when what those particular customers or when they're using it to the debt service associated with it. You are a system that is maturing and so not as much growth. And so many times when you are a system that no longer has a lot of growth happening, you're going to start gravitating to a lot more rate funded capital because that's repair and replacement capital. The current users that are using the system are wearing out and causing that system to be depleted. And so they should be the ones paying for that system. Hopefully, let me know if that answered your question.
Thank you. Brian, did you have a question? I saw your hand was raised, but I don't see it raised now. Are you okay?
Well, I was going to ask Jason or his staff. We kind of have this conversation every time we go through this exercise annually, and we talk about we build in capital expenditures into rates, and we project them out and build that. We build that in for recovery, whether it's through rates or through, I guess, through funding, through bond funding at some point. But I've asked a few times in the past about how real those projections are relative to what our actual experience is. And given that 2020 is such an unusual year, and I think we had this conversation for 2019 as well. I mean, there have been times where we've pushed projects into future periods, and it has seemed to me that that has meant that current rates were funding a certain level of capital expenditures that never materialized. And that's something on my part, or that statement on my part might be inaccurate, but that was my perception a few times when we had this discussion. And so I guess given what's happened in 2020 with COVID and changes in staff, and I would be willing to bet that projects were put off because it was just a tall order in such a difficult year. I guess my question is, did we have a big gap between what we projected for 2020 and what's built into current rates? And if there is a gap, did that influence this analysis that's been presented to us tonight with respect to CapEx in 2021 and 2022? Or how was that dealt with, or was it dealt with at all in the analysis?
So good question. The short answer is yes, there are projects that were slated to get completed this year in this biennium that have not happened, that have been pushed off. Some due to COVID, some due to some staff movement, and some just, to be frank, are a very complex project, right? We are well underway on the skater project. I would say if you'd asked me 2 years ago, where we are today, where we wanted to be 2 years ago, no, I would say we're behind, but there's some pretty good reasons for it because of the complexity of the project. So it's a little bit of the combination of all. As part of the capital program though, Matt, Lawan, and I all go through the projects and figure out what's actually going to get done and what available funding is not going to, or what available funding will be done at the end of this year that feeds into the rate conversation for the next biennium. And so we actually went through and identified which projects we think are going to get done, at what percentage, what's left on the table, and that does feed into the conversation for the rates in the next biennium.
I will just add really quick to that. Some of those projects being pushed out from 19 and 20 that we expected to do and didn't do for various different reasons, were the reason we had those significant rate increases in 19 and 20. And because they've been pushed out, but that cash has been accumulated, that's another reason why the rates we're proposing for 21 and 22 are a little bit lower than originally anticipated a couple years ago. So it's the combination of all those things that are leading to a little bit lower rate increases projected for this biennium.
Okay, so to put it in layman's terms for me, because I'm a simpleton, to the extent we had an assumed level of capital in 2019 and 2020 in rates, and to the extent we didn't spend it, that money has been retained and stays in the utility funds and will be used for utility operations and CapEx prospectively. It's not disappearing,
Absolutely.
it's getting absorbed into the general city fund or anything like that. It stays with the utility where it belongs. Is that correct?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Sorry, the dog is barking, so I was on mute. Steve, you're up next.
Thank you. So my second question was just actually on the SCADA line item that was on both the sewer and the water project list. Was listed at the 3.1 million in both, and I was just trying to remember, is that because that's a $6.2 million project that's 50% funded by both utilities? It's not, they're not paying each half of a 3 million, it's that's 3 million each in a $6 million project.
Correct. So you recall that through the master planning process and through the design process, we haven't been able to actually split out the project, 25, 75. It's been 50-50 all along the way. So we've been combining the SCADA system into one system. And so up until this point, it's been a 50-50 split. So it is 3.1 from each utility. I'll put an asterisk there, and that is the way the SCADA project's actually going to come into fruition is we'll actually be in front of the utility board next month and likely in front of the council the end of this year or early next year with an authorization to bid. And we fully expect to bid the water side of the SCADA project first and foremost. And so once that work takes place, then the water is going to pay their fair share, their costs associated to the SCADA project, and the sewer will pay their share. SCADA on the sewer side will come at a later point in time because we're doing this ventilation study right now as part of the project where we have to go through and evaluate the ventilation requirements of all the pump stations to make sure other configurations aren't needed at the pump stations before we move forward with the SCADA replacement. So SCADA will likely, on the sewer side, will likely happen 6 months, 12 months later, depending on what the ventilation study actually dictates on what modifications have to be made to those pump stations. But so once that happens, the short answer is once that happens, water is going to pay their fair share, sewer will pay their fair share. Right now, the 3.1 is based off the early analysis of what we think it will be. When it's all said and done, it'll pay their appropriate costs.
Got it. So the 50-50 allocation will be calculated more precisely later. Got it.
Correct. And in all reality, at the end of the day, I expect the sewer side to be more expensive than the water side. There's 17 pump stations. There's just more to it.
Thank you.
Trying to see if anybody's their hand. Any other questions? George.
I picked up on what Angie was saying about matching debt service funding with long life projects. And in those graphs, it looks like the debt service is a pretty small portion of the revenue requirements. And I was just wondering, and maybe everybody knows this but me, how is the decision made to go with debt service versus rate increases? It looks like debt service would mitigate some of the rate increases, I think. But I'm curious as to how does the city go about determining which funding mechanism to use?
Matt, you want to take it? In the past, or Lawan, in the past, it has been a recommendation. I will say, as the utility board members that have been part of this process for a few years, it has been a topic of conversation. And as of at the end of last year, or 2 years ago, I guess, The plan was to issue debt for the meter replacement project and the skater project. I will say one of the components of issuing debt has been the time frame to actually construct the project. So once we issue debt, we have to complete the project construction within 3 years. And so we have to find a project that meets that sweet spot. So we've been trying to get these projects into final design with the updated engineer estimate with the intent to issue debt for those 2 projects. I will certainly say that there are some other projects now that have some pretty decent price points to them, like the booster chlorination station, the water reservoir. I think it's worthy of a conversation to be had if the utility board wants to have it. But 2 years ago, those projects weren't at the level they are now. They've gone up in price for their own reasons. But I think they're definitely worthy of a conversation to be had at this point in time. It's been a recommendation from the utility board that ultimately goes to the council that has dictated that thought process.
And George, I'll just echo what Jason just said. That has been a discussion item on the utility board for at least the last 6 or 7 years. The propriety of bonding, particularly for large projects that will be of utility for citizens on the island for many years to come, rather than trying to pay for those all out of rates. I do think Jason will concur. It has probably been the presumption that most of our capital projects are paid on a pay-as-you-go basis over the last few years. So I think I'm frankly very pleased to see that we are indeed going through the bonding route for the meter project as well as the skater project.
Thank you.
Will, you had a question?
Yeah, just to follow up on the debt conversation. I guess trying to understand the amount of debt that's being proposed taken out. Is that a big number for the amount of debt taken out previously, or not, or is it a normal number? If that makes sense. Like how much debt is that for a project like this, for a city like this?
Yeah, I think I can try that one. The combined total across water and sewer, I think, is around 6 million. That is a relatively low amount compared to what our debt capacity is, meaning the ability to issue much more than that. It's a fairly standard number when you look at historically what debt issuance or bond issuances the city has done in the past. Lakeline was the most, and it was significantly more than that. So
not a big number. Okay.
I believe the Lakeline was 15, if it comes off the top of my head, but I could be wrong.
Okay.
With 2 different sources. Yeah.
Okay. Thanks.
Steve, you had a question.
And I guess I was also just partly in answering George's question that I think one of the policy slides that Angie showed earlier showed that kind of policy directive of a $2 million cut point of projects over, projects under being debt funded versus rate funded. But we didn't necessarily hear where exactly that $2 million guideline has come from. And I think we're saying that basically that's just kind of what's been done, or a number that's been used. But obviously between the interplay of that guideline plus the ratio that you'd mentioned as far as how much debt the city can handle. I'm not sure if it's actually even the city itself that's the debt, or if it's the debt is being related to the fund for each of these individual projects, or I wasn't sure exactly on that piece, but
it would be both, but it's monitored at the city level, but also we would be reviewed for each of the funds and what their revenue capacity could handle.
Got it. Okay. So, but just that is so when you talk about us having a recommendation to say, well, maybe we should, debt finance some more of these projects, is that a matter of recommending that maybe we should alter that that guideline as far as that $2 million kind of threshold, so that we're looking at potentially debt financing somewhat smaller projects, or is it at that kind of $3 million level still, or $2 million, that $2 million level, is that still a good cut point based on the projects that you're seeing that you could actually get done within a 3-year period? It seems like actually a little bit smaller projects might be easier to be getting done within your funding window, or that 3-year window. So is that $2 million the optimal, cut point?
And I would invite Angie to speak to that, given your background and experience, Angie. And that policy is from the city's budget policies, that $2 million threshold.
Yeah, I think that's probably has come from a historical perspective of just maybe what, kind of comfort level. But I also think that, when you get below a $2 million, the issuance costs of revenue bonds also will not make sense for smaller issues. And so that's probably one of the reasons why maybe they set it at the $2 million before, is if you're getting too small, then, you're really paying a lot for issuance costs on a bond that really might not make cost effective sense. In terms of the $2 million, I'm not sure that necessarily is the appropriate number. It could be higher, it could be lower. I think if you wanted to look at additional debt funding, it probably is something that, we'd have to bring back to council. So that could potentially be a policy issue adjustment. We did kind of rely on that policy to kind of set some of the framework and the bounds in terms of what decisions we made for capital funding in this particular plan.
I would just add to that, historically with our capital program, we historically haven't had a lot of north of $2 million projects, at least in my 5 years that I've been here. So so just sort of a common sense, like it seems like it's an appropriate number for the size of our capital program that we have in place. It seems to make sense.
Sure. Will, do you have another question?
Oh, no, I don't. I'll take my hand down. Sorry.
Oh, okay, you gotta unraise your hand though.
Yeah.
There we go. All right. Does anyone else have any questions for Ms. Valdez in particular, or Jason on this? Anything else that should be discussed in kind of general session before we actually get to the issue about making specific rate recommendations that we'll present to the council? Steve.
Well, so just, I guess, you were mentioning, should we actually propose to the council to basically to support, I think, the Jason's thought about revisiting whether or not we should debt finance a couple of those other large projects at this point, especially things like the water tower and things like that are going to be 20 and 30-year investments in that sense. Should we make a recommendation to the council that they kind of revisit debt financing on a couple of those other projects that were breaching over that $2 million mark? And are those particular projects that can actually get done in the project completion window that you're talking about, that 3-year construction window?
I'll just speak to the 3-year construction window real quickly, and that would be the way I would ask staff to get these done is I would get these fully designed, and once we're, we wouldn't go take the debt until they're fully designed and ready to go. So we'd have to get that work done, the design work done, and then go from there. I will say on the meter replacement projects, we have a preferred vendor, but we have to negotiate the contract, and so there's some time that has to still take place there. So there's still some lead time. We still have to go through the design process on the lining of the reservoirs and things like that. But that's what I would intend for us to do if that's the direction that Utility Board and Council so chooses, is we get them fully designed before we go implement them, so that we would get them done in that 3-year time period. That's the bottom line. The meter replacement project, we have a contract in place. Through the RFP process, we learned that it's not going to be an issue of whether or not they can replace all the meters within our time frame. They can do it. It comes down to a comfort level from the city, from the communication and the community perspective in terms of, what's the appropriate speed and making sure that we get our communications out there ahead of time, that we transfer everything into our financial system accordingly, and that our staff are trained. It's more of the operational side of the house that really we got to make sure it's fine-tuned, ready to go. The replacing the meters and the construction piece of it, that's the easy piece for a contractor. It's some of those other nuances of once they're in the ground and making sure it's operational and it works accordingly. And that's the piece that we have to make sure we line out on our end as well.
Okay, so
I will say, I I think one of our charges, Steve, is that we have to make a recommendation to the city council because it is on the agenda for the 17th.
Understood. Again, that was more of a general discussion, I guess, to some degree. If as a group, we think that it would be better to try and look at one or two of those additional projects as debt funded eventually, i.e. when Jason's team has them all fully engineered and ready to go, but it would basically put their debt raise or their debt issuance further into this project, 5-year period, but then would take it out of projects that were being funded by the rate-based funding mechanisms that we're talking about. So it obviously would change the percent increases required through this 5-year analysis window. Lower it, it would reduce it.
Jason, did you have a response to that?
Yeah, so and Matt Lawan, correct me here or Angie, correct me, but so I'm looking at the schedule, and the water reservoir improvements is going to be in design for next year, and the actual construction is scheduled for 2022. And so recall the board updates rates so we're setting a rate for the 2 years, but we update them every single year. So when I look at this schedule, it looks like the meters are likely to happen next year. And like I said, the water side of the SCADA system is likely to happen next year. But as far as the only other piece to it that we've talked about has been the booster chlorination station. That will be ready for construction next year. So what I was going to say is we could, with the intent of still issuing debt for the meter replacement project in SCADA, you could do that and then come back once we have these projects designed at next year's rate conversation to say, hey, if the board wants us to pursue additional debt at next time, we could add those projects into the fold because we'll have them designed ready to go. We'll be further along in the process. That might be a way to take a bite at this apple as well tonight.
Very good. Stephen, you were next.
Yeah, I just had a question about the Lakeline investigation. So it sounds like we have a presumption of what the service life is based on the condition of similar pipes that our neighbors have. Is the purpose of the investigation, obviously they have to find it first, but is it to get better fidelity on what the service life is that's remaining? And is there a lot of risk that it will be worse than we expect?
Ooh, that's a loaded question. So there's risk associated to it, don't get me wrong. I will say we've done as much analysis on this pipe as we possibly can without actually tracking it down and looking inside of it. So the condition assessment is actually just that. So the board will recall, past members will recall that we actually had a partial plug of our lake line a couple of years ago where we actually had to do an emergency repair. We had to send divers into the water. We had to go through a bunch of permitting, of course, and send divers in the water and cut the pipe open, unblock it, restore it, and put it back together. That's what sort of prompted us to move this project prioritization up in our list. In the rest of our sewer system, we are routinely doing closed circuit television analysis, doing pipe inspections, cleaning of our system. I will tell you that this lake line is not, because we don't know where it is and we don't have access to it easily. It's not getting the same level of care that the rest of our system is. So this condition assessment is to do that. It's to identify where it is and figure out how to get into the pipe to actually maintain it more efficiently on a long-term basis. And so part of that will be evaluating the existing useful life left in that pipe once we identify where it is and getting into it. So
so how old is it and what is our current guess on the life remaining?
It depends on the section of pipe. So there is one reach 4, that is and that's on the north end of Mercer Island. That is the area of concern that we've been talking about with these utility board and the council for years. We've been putting aside some money to actually replace that section of pipe because of the type of pipe it is. And we know that it potentially could be problematic for us down the road. So that is the area of pipe that we have the most concern about. It's the way it's scheduled on the CIP is at the recommendation of our engineering consultants who help do the general sewer plan to get into it, identify what the condition of is it, and come up with a game plan for it. But it is, I want to say it's on the horizon. It's in the 6-year spreadsheet. I want to say it's possibly year 2023 where we start looking at how to get into that section of pipe. So it's a couple years out, but it's not too far out. So
Thanks, Jason.
Great. Any other questions from any members of the board? If not, I think we're at the point where it would be appropriate to take a recommendation, take some motions. I think for purpose of keeping things organized, we should take them one at a time. Just because we did stormwater last week, so it's therefore first. The recommended rate increase for 21-22 is 5.5% from staff. Do any members of the board have a motion to make in that regard? Anybody?
So, yeah, I'm comfortable with the answers that we received on the inquiries on that. I had motion that we approve that, or that we, I guess, recommend that 5.5, approve that recommendation for the 5.5% increase to the council.
Is there a second for that?
I'll second Steve.
Steven seconds. Is there further discussion on that motion? Further discussion on that motion? Hearing none, Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Mr. Chairman, if you could please clarify who made the first and the second, please.
Steve Milton made the motion. Stephen Majeski seconded.
Okay, that's what throws me off.
Yep. So that's how I'm going to refer to everybody. It's Steve and Stephen. So long as you two are okay with that, I think that's the best way to keep everybody straight.
Perfect.
Okay. Board Member Marshall?
So,
Approve.
Board Member Milton?
Aye.
Board Member Thomas?
Aye.
Vice Chair DeVore?
Aye.
Board Member Majewski?
Aye.
Chair O'Connell?
aye.
And Board Member Bacorny?
Aye.
Thank you.
Very good. I'll then turn to water next. There is a recommendation from staff that we raise the rates for water 5.25% for both 2021 and 2022 for this biennium. Is there a motion to approve that recommendation?
I will move to approve.
That was Board Member Marshall.
Yes.
Is there a second?
I second.
That was Mr. Portnoy. Is there further discussion of that motion? I did have one question for the finance folks, I think. If I look at the memorandum that we were provided, it looks like the fund balance under this proposal dips quite severely and then kind of recovers, but not nearly to the same level. If I'm looking at page 3 of your memo, fund balance, the ending fund balance goes from 13 million, gets quite low 2023, 2024, and then kind of comes back up to the 4.6 level. Is that of some concern, or is there expectation that that'll get addressed after the current biennium?
think it obviously it reflects the capital spending. So it's pretty big dollars that we're spending on some water projects in those years. And with the long-term policies, we expect that to recover.
Okay. That's what I was hoping to hear. Thank you.
And is the
there any other
incoming?
I'm sorry, Steve?
Yeah, just asking, so the incoming fund balance being higher than ordinary, that's also basically due to having basically spent less on projects this year, right?
Correct.
Okay.
All right, thank you. Any other discussion? Any other discussion? Hearing none, Madam Clerk, will you call the roll?
Thank you, sir. Chair O'Connell,
Aye.
Vice Chair DeVore,
Aye.
Board Member Marshall,
Aye.
Board Member Picorni,
Aye.
Board Member Thomas,
Aye.
Board Member Majewski,
Aye.
and Board Member Milton.
Aye.
Seems that has passed. Thank you. Last is the sewer rate. We have a recommendation from staff that the rates for sewer should increase 4% in both 2021 and 2022. Is there a motion on that matter? That would be a motion to approve the recommendation if that's what the voting party would make. Is there a motion?
I'd move to approve the recommendation for the sewer rates.
Vice Chair, is there a second?
Yeah, I'll second that.
That was Member Milton who seconded. Is there any further discussion as to the sewer rate? Is there any further discussion as to the motion? Hearing none, I'll ask the Madam Clerk if you could call the roll again, please.
Board Member Milton,
Aye.
Board Member Majewski,
Aye.
Board Member Thomas,
Aye.
Chair O'Connell,
Aye.
Board Member Marshall,
Aye.
Vice Chair DeVore,
Aye.
and Board Member Picorni.
Aye.
That motion passes as well. Thank you. Unless there's other matters, the next item on our agenda is to go and review our work plan for the remainder of 2020. We have a meeting scheduled November 10 with what looks to be a good agenda for that. Before we discuss the work plan, that specific agenda, I would ask Jason or Madam Clerk, I mean, are we likely, we have been getting bumped quite a bit lately as to our hearing dates. Are we likely that that meeting would go forward on November 10?
I'm hoping so. I'm just Deb, shaking your head no. I'm hoping so, assuming Lisa and the other council members don't need another day for a council meeting, but I'm sure she's hoping that she doesn't have another council meeting too.
It's the day before, November 10th is the day before Veterans Day. So.
Yes.
I'm voting,
I'm sorry,
I'm voting against any additional council meetings for the rest of the year, okay? So we're getting burned out already.
So just to clarify what you meant by observing that it's the day before Veterans Day, you're saying that people will not be likely to add new meetings.
We will not have a meeting that night.
All right. So I think we at least have the potential of going forward as planned. That would be good. Jason, anything else to comment about the November 10 agenda?
Yeah, so just real quickly, I'll just cover the 3 agenda items. Recology, we will be, oh my goodness, we're a year into the implementation now. So we will have the Recology team present first. They will talk to us about how the year in review went. We will talk about the commodity adjustment values. We've gotten that report. And then obviously what they've learned in the last year, and opportunity for the board to ask them questions about service deliveries and things like that. But it seems like it's been after maybe perhaps a little bit of a rough start last October, it's definitely smoothed out, and it's been smooth sailing ever since. Knock on wood, it continues that way. We'll do a skater project update. As I referenced earlier, we expect to go out to bid for the water side of the skater project later this year or early next year. So it'll be a good opportunity to have the consultant come in and provide an update on that project specific to the water side of the house. And then we will talk about the booster station and then the risk and resiliency assessment, which we are required to complete by June 31st of next year. So it'll be definitely an insightful meeting, get some project updates, and then it'll be good to talk to the Recology team as well. So that's what's on the docket for November.
You know, a question for you, Jason, and I'm asking a question. I don't see anyone else has raised their hand on it at this point. You know, we canceled so many meetings in the middle of the year. You know, is this board behind? I ask because we have most years not met in December, but you know, I don't think that's a policy, and I don't think it's written in stone that we can't meet in December. So my question is, you know, are we behind? Are there things that we should be paying attention to? Do we need to schedule a December meeting?
That's a fair question. Let me put together the anticipated 2021 work schedule. Let me see what's on our horizon for their first part of next year, and see if we do need a December meeting. I will say, compared to the rest of the boards and commissions, I actually think we're a little bit further ahead than some others. Some of them are just now picking up for the first time this week. So we're on our second meeting, so we can check that box. I will say the rate conversation definitely had us concerned because we were getting into the conversation so late, but I feel like we did a good job of getting through that the last 2 meetings. And so that's good. But let me put together the early work plan for 2021. And why don't I reach out to the chair and the vice chair directly with that draft work plan, and we can talk about whether or not we want to think about adding a December meeting.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Anybody else? Any comments or questions about the work plan?
Sounds good.
Agreed. And just so that I can confirm, because I did put it on my calendar, the presentation to the city council about the rates is the 17th?
Correct.
And I am anticipating being there.
Perfect. It'll be via the Zoom platform.
I anticipate being here. And the whole city council can hear my 145-pound dog when he wants to start letting us know that he's here. Any other discussion of the work plan or other matters for the board? Any other items for the board? If not, I'd accept a motion from one of the board members to adjourn. Come on, guys, someone's got to make a motion.
Motion to adjourn.
I heard everybody then chime in all at once. I think that was Brian and Steven seconded. Yes. And so we'll take that as that motion passes by acclamation. Thanks, everybody, and we will talk again in November.
All right, thanks, guys.
Board members, please do stay on until the board members, please do stay on until the meeting recording is stopped. Thank you.